everyone gets into that's the hard part about Bitcoin, because can something with no physical existence still have value? And I mean, there's a couple of different answers to that. One, I think you quoted me at one point that I still use with people, is money is whatever we agree it is. So part of its value comes from just the acceptance of it as money, as a bearer asset that's intrinsically different from its properties make it that way, not so much any physical property it has, but all these digital properties that it has. There's also a slightly other way to think about it, in the sense that if you've got this digital asset that's not tied to anything, it's seen as kind of a weakness that it has no physical form. But quite often, as you kind of learn, what is your greatest strength is also your greatest weakness, and vice versa. So part of what gives Bitcoin this exceptional amount of value in that sense is because it has no physical form. Because if it did, there would be no way to transport it from one computer to another just across a general internet connection. So the properties of it, even though it doesn't really exist, it's only an idea, is kind of along the same lines of an idea having some value. And when you buy Bitcoin, what you're buying is a stake in that idea. There are also other people that would say that the real value of it comes from the amount of power generated to keep the network secure, because every block that gets written, it took electricity to write that block. So if you want to look at it as what was there, it took a certain amount of electricity to create the Bitcoin, and that'll fluctuate. It's really just providing security for the network. But the more power that goes into it, you could argue that there are some people that would argue that that's where the value comes from, is that power that's going into securing the network too.
Well, that's actually a very good segue into the second question that I had here, which is, a few subscribers wanted to know how much energy is required to mine Bitcoin, and they also wanted, for fairness, to contrast that against how much it takes to mine gold. So, you speak a little bit about the power consumption involved to mine Bitcoin?
Yeah. So I think that's where you get a lot of people, because the automatic assumption is that if it takes power to mine Bitcoin, more power should equal more Bitcoin. And really, that's just the level that it's securing the network at. And that's a much longer discussion into the technicalities of that. But it's really hard to make that comparison about anything, because when you talk about Bitcoin has this perfect way of defining how much power went into it. Whereas if you look at anything you would be comparing it to, there's not that same level. Like if we talk about how much, we've got numbers here for how much it costs to mine an ounce of gold, or how to mine an individual Bitcoin. But when you talk about gold, you're also talking about, the manpower that went into setting up the mines, the amount of earth you dug up, the gas you used doing that. So that's where those estimates come from. Just like if you wanted to compare it to an existing payment system, you can't just compare it to, what the cost is to the person running the card through the card reader. It's the entire infrastructure of banking that's using that much power. I think the biggest thing I get into with Bitcoin is I don't like to think of the power as necessarily a good or bad thing, the amount that it takes to mine a Bitcoin. I do like that Bitcoin can be used anywhere. So while the majority of it right now is probably still off of coal and oil, like everyone else's electric they get in their home is, the advantage to having Bitcoin work the way it does is it can also be used to subsidize renewable energy projects. Because if you lived out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a desert, you might have this incredibly rich opportunity to create solar power at scale, but you still have to transport that power somewhere, and that takes a lot of investment to build power lines going from the middle of nowhere to somewhere where that power can be used. So if you wanted to do that today, you could subsidize that by just dropping in a shipping container full of mining rigs and using all that power you're generating to mine Bitcoin, and then subsidizing that construction and kickstarting it with, and you could do it with any cryptocurrency, honestly, but you can actually take that and move towards more renewable energy sources by using the variability to just drop a computer in somewhere and mine Bitcoin with it.
Okay, well, let's say that I wanted to set up a server farm and a bunch of solar cells in the desert and mine for Bitcoin. How much power do you think it would take before I'd be awarded, let's say, 1 Bitcoin in payment?
I'd have to run that through a mining calculator. You can do that math for what the current rate is. That's going to change over time because the mining rate and the hash rate, as it's called, has been going up since its inception. What most people do in that scenario is, because the mining is kind of like a lottery where you're trying to compete to write the next block. You actually get more of a fixed income supply if you join what's known as a mining pool, where you contribute to a group of miners and you're all sharing the rewards. In the notes we have, I think right now it's somewhere around 72,000 gigawatts per Bitcoin that you're talking about. So you would have to end up doing, depending on how much electricity you expect to generate, you would basically take that number and run it through a mining calculator and figure out how much you would make at the given time. And then you'd also have to factor in, looking at the hash rate, if it's going up, down, what you would need, what your standard deviation would be for what the most you would be earning in versus the least, because at the end of the day, no one can really see the future. All we can do is make predictions based on the past, right?
Right. Did you just say 72,000 gigawatt hours per Bitcoin?
I'm not, something like, I believe that was the number I pulled up, was 72,000 gigawatts per BTC as of April 2020, which is definitely a lot, right? But that's based off the hash power. So it is. I mean, you are burning through a lot of electricity to secure the network. And that's kind of why you'll hear a lot of, when we talk about altcoins later, there are a lot of people that don't like altcoins just for that reason, because they only feel like we need one proof of work chain, which is the real invention here. Is in Bitcoin, you're talking about, we figured out how to do consensus at a massive scale, and we did it through proof of work. And there are other models that are now coming out to try and give different characteristics to how to form consensus. But the proof of work, there's now, I guess at least 10 of the major coins that are proof of work coins. And the idea is you probably only need one, but they're going to exist regardless, because it only, like I said, it doesn't matter how much power you're putting into the network. If 75% of Bitcoin's miners went offline tomorrow, it wouldn't really affect anything other than the amount of time it took to write each block. And that would affect it, that would even itself out after the difficulty adjustment after 2 weeks. I know that's a little on the technical side, but basically it doesn't matter how much power you're putting into Bitcoin, you're getting the same amount of Bitcoin out of the system. So we don't need as much as we have. It's just a function of how much these people want to mine Bitcoin. Of the miners basically determine how much mining goes into it, which also is a factor in determining the current price, because they're the ones that sell into the market constantly. When you run a mining farm, you obviously have to sell some of the Bitcoin that you're mining to pay for your electricity, to pay for your miners, to pay for any employees that you have.
It kind of sounds like an arbitrage type situation where, if you know you can get, the more Bitcoin for your power than you're going to be consuming in power, you put your computer online, and then if the price goes down too low, I imagine the miners probably pull their computers off, right?
Yeah, actually, I've heard it referred to as an electricity arbitrage trade quite frequently.
Well, it seems like Bitcoin, at least from what I can see, does consume a lot of power. I know I mentioned that in my last video, and a lot of people took exception to that, and they're like, well, how much power does it take to mine an ounce of gold? And I did take a look at that, and it looks like James Turk of Gold Money did a survey back in 2016, and at the time they were polling reports from the various major gold miners to figure out how much each was emitting in greenhouse gases. And it looked like he was able to find from 18 of the largest gold mining organizations that on average, it takes about 8.3 gigajoules to mine 1 ounce of gold. And I did the math, and that turns out to be 2.3 megawatt hours per ounce of gold. Now, just to put that into perspective for everybody, that's enough to power the average US household for 2 to 3 months. So think about that a little bit. That's not all electrical power. That's a combination of fossil fuel consumption as well as electrical power. But if you want an ounce of gold, the amount of energy contained in that ounce of gold is about 2 to 3 months worth of average household use. And I'm not even sure if that was for a finished product. I believe that probably was just representing the Doré bars, which are then exported to refiners, who then refine it to 3 or 4 nines purity before striking them into coins. So gold itself is a very power intensive operation. And that's probably one of the reasons why gold is as valuable as it is, simply because it takes that much work to produce 1 ounce of gold. But from what you're saying, it seems like each Bitcoin requires orders of magnitude more electricity than the power required to produce an ounce of gold.
It does. It does. But you also have to keep in mind when you're talking that comparison, the number of tons annually of gold that come out of the ground is between 2,500 and 3,000 tons. And that's 29,000 troy ounces, whereas Bitcoin's going to go, I mean, just on even if the hash rate were to stay the same and nobody else wanted to mine Bitcoin, the amount of electricity required to make a Bitcoin is going to continue to go up, just because there's always going to be less of it coming, new supply coming into the system, that halvening that happens every 4 years. So you also have to keep that in mind. But once again, when we talk about energy, I think the biggest thing is like we could also compare both gold and Bitcoin to Christmas tree lights that I think globally use more than either of them. And no one would say, I don't think we should be lighting up trees at Christmas time. It's more how we're producing that power. So to me, it seems like if we're focusing too much on how much goes into either of them, we're kind of missing the point. I mean, the idea should be that if we live on a spinning magnet orbiting a giant nuclear reactor, energy should be cleaner than what we have today. Like, we shouldn't need to keep running dino juice. And that's separate from both Bitcoin and from gold. You could make the same thing. Gold mining could be made much more environmentally friendly if all of the excavators, everything, instead of burning fossil fuels, they could take electricity. But then you get back to, how do you get electricity to remote parts of the world and subsidize that process, which I think is kind of an area where Bitcoin and crypto shine.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move on to questions related to value and scarcity then, because I think we're starting to move in that direction. One subscriber wants to know, does money need to possess intrinsic value?
And I mean, I think honestly, that's an area where gold bugs and Bitcoiners completely agree, is that, of course, it needs to have intrinsic value. The real question, I think, to me is can code on a computer